Hello, or good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to XBOSoft's quarterly webinar. This quarter, we're having a special guest speaker, Melissa Tondi, and Melissa will be talking about automation. We're doing it wrong. A lot of times we talk about what we're doing right or how to do it right, but this time we're going to be talking about the opposite, which is what we're doing wrong and possibly what we can do right. Just a quick note about XBOSoft. We were founded 12 years ago. And we have two primary business lines. One of them is consulting, and the other one is about in software testing. We very simply, better software testing makes better software. Just a little bit about me. I'm the CEO and founder of XBOSoft, and you can read all about me on LinkedIn if you want to, but what you won't find on LinkedIn is that I love cycling. I was just counting my miles the other day, and I think I've ridden my bicycle over 100,000 miles. So, and I've traveled over 60 countries, but today's webinar is really about Melissa. And Melissa is our guest speaker. We're really glad to have her here today. Can you go on to the next slide here? Let's see if we can advance this. Yeah, Melissa's been working in QA for forever, it seems, and she's very much involved in the QA and software testing community. She's now with Rainforest, and we're just really lucky to be able to grab some of her time to share with us her knowledge in QA and in particular in automation today. A few house rules. Just a few house rules before we get started here. Welcome, Melissa, by the way. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Just a few house rules. You know, we got a control panel. You can enter in questions in the chat panel. And all the participants are muted other than Melissa and myself. I will be taking your questions and feeding them to Melissa as much as I can without interrupting too much. And then if we get to the end and we have a bunch of questions that we have some time, we'll certainly answer them. And if we don't have time for that, you can certainly just send them to us and we will put the answers in our blog. In addition, you'll be receiving the recording after the webinar. So I'll just let Melissa take it away and do her thing.
All right. Thank you, Phil, and thank you to XBOSoft for hosting this. I've been looking forward to this one. So hopefully we'll have as much of a collaborative discussion as we can over the webinar. But as Phil mentioned, if you do have any questions, I welcome them throughout. We'll let Phil moderate, and I may kind of just give some prompts for questions after kind of key components within the slides. But really, you know, what I really wanted to kind of get across with this is, you know, as you can tell by the title, maybe slightly controversial because we're emphasizing the word wrong in here. But really, I kind of looked at, you know, as I was responsible for kind of running and building up test automation within my quality engineering teams and QA teams, we really had a lot of failures, right? And so we kind of approached this with a very one-sided view and didn't really take into account a lot of areas that you know, we needed to be considered to kind of have a full-blown enterprise-wide test automation strategy that was not only consistent, but also scalable. So a lot of the content in here talks about, you know, real life areas where we got it wrong, and what I kind of talk about the misconceptions or misperceptions of what automation is, and also kind of call them the misses, and then how we addressed those misses. So hopefully a lot of these points will resonate, if not all of them. One or two of those will resonate with you, and then certainly we'll have some open Q&A at the end, but we're going to kind of jump right into the session and go. So before I start, as Phil mentioned, I've been in the high majority of my career, my 20 plus years in the industry. I've spent almost all of them within the QA and QE spaces. And then over the last 12 years or so, have really focused on companies that are either in using or kind of using the agile approach or have a desire to be. So, and then with that, with the teams that I have helped build and innovate, I really focus on three tenets: efficiency within those, innovation, and culture. So before I start, I just want to make sure, are we good to go? Everybody can hear me? Phil, are we good? Start?
I think we're good, Melissa.
Okay, great.
Keep rolling.
Okay. All right. So, so we're going to talk about first of all, what test automation is, right? So I really like this quote that we've had. Test automation makes humans more efficient, not less essential. So if you've ever heard me talk or ever read anything that I've written in the past, I really am a huge proponent and advocate for QA, quality engineers, software testers, whatever your title or role is, we're technologists. And if we're not early adopters and embracers of technology, we're missing a really big component of where our industry is going, and in a lot of cases, where our industry currently is. So, you know, test automation is an avenue to really help make us more efficient. So when we talk about test automation, it tends to be, you know, we're talking about the overall approach and strategy for using tools to augment the execution of test cases, scripts, or scenarios, right? So that's kind of the definition as it applies to this talk. There are lots of philosophical conversations and schools of thought on test automation, but just to kind of level set, that's really the definition that I want to make sure that we're kind of having at the forefront during this talk. It's the checker, right? And so it's relying on inputs and outputs, or inputs, and then gives you a set of outputs. But the idea is that if you have a clear test automation strategy that you can contribute to, or that you are already contributing to, we really want to make sure that we are embracing that so that we can become better testers. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means shortly. So let's talk a little bit about what test automation is not, right? It's not a silver bullet. A lot of times, and I always use the kind of the shiny object syndrome. So long ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when kind of commercial tools ruled the world and there were really no other open source solutions for test automation, we would call this the shiny object syndrome, where there would be a sales team that would set up a meeting with you know, whoever had the signing privilege for, you know, a lot of money per year. And so they would generally get that audience. And so you'd have usually a VP, a CTO, CIO, something like that sitting in there. And then all of a sudden those demos look like, from the UI standpoint, it looked like the shiny object, because you could immediately see steps that a tester may take minutes to do or perform by themselves would take sometimes seconds using the tool, right? And so that kind of became the shiny object syndrome. And then therefore, rightfully or wrongfully, that test automation tool became the solution for test automation. But we really want to emphasize that it's really the strategy in place. And then ideally your strategy is so well thought out and collaborative that then the tools that get in there are simply just overlays of the strategy, right? So we don't want to consider that test automation and the adoption of a tool is the only thing that makes you successful. It's not a silver bullet solution. And it's certainly not a comprehensive testing activity. It's one activity in your overall software testing, quality assurance, or QE strategy. It's one area and component of it. It's certainly not all, and it's definitely not comprehensive. And then, of course, you know, when we go back to that that statement of, you know, there are lots of philosophies and schools of thought on this. I don't consider test automation necessarily testing, because ultimately we want the testers to be testing, and we want them to be using test automation in order to augment and to make their own testing more efficient. So that's kind of the driving force and themes that we should be considering as we go through this particular content in the webinar. So let's talk a little bit about what we call the misses, and really what it's not, the misses, right? So we talk about a numbers or a percentage game. A lot of times, and when I ask this question live, I'll usually have people kind of raise their hands, but I like to ask the question of how many times, or how many of you are kind of have a metric or a measure of success that is related to a certain number or percentage of your test cases that are being automated, right? And so sometimes that might look like 100%, right? We've heard lots of people make statements that you should be automating everything. And then we have other scenarios where we want to hit a certain percentage, maybe 75 or 80 or 90% of all test cases should be automated. And that in and of itself would be a good measure of quality. And really what the misperception in that is that the more tests that are automated, the higher the quality of the product. And for those of us who have been doing this for a long time, and a long time may be over a year, we certainly know that that's not necessarily the case. The more tests do not necessarily equal a higher quality of the product. So when we talk about one of the first misses or misperceptions, we want to kind of get out of that numbers game. And again, and just to remind, so what I'll go through here are kind of the misses, and then the second half of this will kind of be talking, we'll go through how we address these misses. So another miss is that we always need a separate role or title within the QA or QE organization that's responsible for all test automation, right? And so what this is driven, and this is one of those areas where I certainly believed that this needed to happen several years ago when I was trying to build a scalable test automation strategy within my department, that I felt that there was always a need for a separate automation engineer, or whatever they were titled, but where their only responsibility was simply coding in order to automate tests or scripts. And so their job or their role was never to actually test or interact with the software, but only to simply create the scripts within the framework that would eventually be used as an automation standpoint. And not that there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with that, but as we'll talk about shortly, it lends itself to some behaviors and activities that aren't necessarily conducive to a collaborative and well thought out team dynamic and staffing. And then, as you get into larger organizations, sometimes we even, there's an assumption made that there needs to be a separate team that's then matrixed, that simply are there to automate tests, right? But again, where the expectation to test and interact with the software is not only included in their job description, but that it's certainly not expected. And then you even have some of those outliers where some automation engineers believe that they shouldn't need to interact with the software, right? So those are some misses that we've certainly seen. And again, not that there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with that, but this is an area where we looked at it, and when we started seeing it from a modern testing standpoint or moving into a quality engineering standpoint, this was one of the contributing factors to us not being as successful as we felt we needed to be, and certainly where we wanted to be. So, and then, as we move on to the next miss, that we assume that QE or the automation engineer owns all automation. And then that they set the priority for all automation that happens within the Agile project team. And we also kind of call this and refer to this as the silo effect, right? So that one person or one team or role within the team sets not only the priority for all automation, but owns all of the automation. And then they decide what gets automated, certainly within a bubble, but absolutely siloed, without really kind of spending time collaboratively with the team to determine what is and should be valuable. We have the middleman strategy, right? And so I kind of put this blurb in there, right? Having a manual tester test first. And you see my little blurb here, but I hate that term of manual testing, only because I think that it has a lot of connotation, that kind of goes around it. But you kind of get what I'm talking about here. And really what we have is, all of a sudden we have our testers that are embedded with the Agile project team, and then they need to test and ensure that the code is stable enough, and then they check a box or they indicate in some kind of serial way that this test case should be automated. And then we essentially throw that over to the fence, and the person who's ultimately responsible for automating that gets to it at some later time, right? And so you kind of have the middleman strategy where that tester determines what should be automated, and then you bring in the automator who then automates that. And so we'll again kind of talk about why that is a miss and how we've addressed that in the past. And then when there's misperceptions on that, test automation is essentially a replacement of the humans, where they are that by adopting a full-blown test automation strategy, that there's then some sort of a correlation between not then kind of reducing the workforce of the testers, because now the tool has replaced those testers, right? And I stress here, if we're not early adopters and embracers of technology, that is an individual kind of career decision, where if we're not embracing tools and technology like test automation, we may have changing responsibilities, right? We may have actually moved ourselves out of a really great career development path because we're not or we're technology adverse in there, right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, as I certainly highlight here, we should be as early adopters of technology as anyone else that we're collaborating with on the day-to-day in our Agile project teams. And we should be embracing all of the professional and technical development within our career, to include test automation. There's certainly other areas that we can focus on and look at developing our own career. But when we start thinking, or when there has been the misperception that somehow adopting a full-blown successful test automation strategy means that there will be a certain X number of testers that are then removed from the team, we know that we have a really big misperception in there. And part of my experience was that, 10, 11 years ago, when I was tasked with building out an enterprise-wide test automation strategy, that there was going to be an outcome that we would reduce the team. And I, maybe ignorantly or naively went into that believing that that was the case. And of course, we all know that if that is how we're being driven, where a tool is therefore going to replace a human in a lot of those components, we're not really putting a lot of value into the human tester and all of the value that they should bring to the project team.
So, but that's, Melissa, that's what all the management wants, right? I mean, they're all talking about, oh, we have to reduce headcount. That's why they want to do automation to begin with. So how do you argue with them?
Yeah. So, if the goal is to reduce headcount, that we're looking at that in an extremely shallow and narrow way, right? If there is a goal with the company that they have to reduce headcount, that goal is going to be obtained regardless of whether or not we have a test automation strategy. What we really, the way that we really speak to management that has this as an outcome, is that we really build in a higher quality, because by partnering a good test automation strategy with really good testers or quality engineers, we actually allow the testers to do what they do best, which is interacting with the software and becoming a much better user advocate, so that we are standing and kind of closing that gap between what was originally thought out and how our users were going to be interacting with the software and how they actually do that. So if you think about it, there's a net gain of efficiency when we start automating these repetitive tasks. And the idea is once you've identified those inefficiencies and you've addressed those by automating those, then you should be spending your time in areas that you previously didn't. And so then that in and of itself is the value add to adopting test automation, is where your testers are spending much more time interacting with the software and giving higher valuable information on their experience while interacting with that software.
Okay. Good
So,
answer.
so as we kind of go, so now I've kind of talked about the misses, right? Of how did we get to this situation. Now let's talk a little bit about the hits. And this is really kind of the meat of the content in the session, is that we talk about how do we address some of those misperceptions, or all the misperceptions that we talked about, right? So we have the misses and now we have the hits. So we talk about the percentage or the number games, right? So the idea here is to automate the right test, not necessarily try and hit a number. And one of the ways that we've kind of counterbalanced that is by using a much better and easier to attain and obtain metric that we titled the A of A, which simply means the automated of automatable measure. And that really kind of talks about, I've always been a kind of a three-pronged approach of a priority standpoint. So the way that this looks like in real life is to look at the number, the types of tests and where is it going to provide value, right? So when we look across the SDLC and who is responsible for testing and who's responsible for automating tests, we want to make sure that the tests that are being automated by those in the QA team, whether it's a separate automation engineer role or a quality engineer or a tester that has test automation experience, we really want to focus on the most valuable tests that are going to provide the best feedback at any given time. So the way that we look at this is we prioritize those tests, and I like to say that we prioritize tests starting with the tests that are being automated by dev, and simply put, those are the intake tests, that combination of integration and unit tests that generally are done from the dev team. And so we start to the left there, and then when we move into what QA is responsible for automating, we like to start with the basic building blocks of tests, and in my opinion, those can easily be started by looking at smoke tests and by aligning with the industry definition of a smoke test. If we start small and we use those automated suites running green to give instant feedback to the dev team, they can go much faster. So by doing that, when we have a prioritized approach to automation, what happens is that if any of those priority one automated tests are in a red state, we know that that is critical enough that it causes some immediate action. And again, I'll kind of walk through this a little bit later, but we want to make sure that we're having a much more consistent and repeatable process when we approach test automation, so that the team is always focused on the highest priority tests. And as long as those are running green and those are providing the right feedback and information to those who are dependent on them, then we can move into the second priority and then third priority. But it's very serial in that standpoint, that we don't jump or move into priorities, or we don't automate the easy functions without having everything to the left and the higher priority suites of tests running green. So how do we address the separate role, right? And so again, and I keep repeating this, but it's important to note that if you are on this webinar and you happen to have a title of automation engineer, or your main and only task is to be automating, it's not necessarily that it's inherently wrong, because clearly there's probably a need to have dedicated team members whose sole responsibility is to automate, especially if there's a skill deficiency or gap there. But what I like to say is, for smaller teams of maybe 6 or lower, fewer team members, there's a lot of kind of the jack of all trades types of roles that need to happen. Or for those of you who may be in a startup culture or working with a true startup, there's a lot of kind of sharing the wealth that goes along with that. So when we talk about the separate role or title as a long-term strategy, we want to make sure that we're getting a jump start, right? We want to make sure that that there's certainly somebody who can quickly execute the overall QA automation strategy. But when we start mandating a number or a percentage of automated tests, we feel like we have to bolster up that test automation team. But really what winds up happening is we wind up overloading them, and then we have this behemoth suite of tests or several suites of tests that are not really maintainable, and then they wind up becoming what we lovingly refer to in the older industry as shelfware, right? And so now we have a lot of test automated suites that have been running red, and because we have set up that goal that all or a very high percentage of all test cases need to be automated, then the team is simply working to meet that goal versus looking at adding the value. And so we have lots and lots of tests that are then running red, and no one ever has the time to actually look at them or maintain those, right? So it's not necessarily wrong to have a separate role or team that's responsible for that, but if we align that and partner that with automating the right things and the most valuable items first, that's collaboratively agreed to within the project team, we're going to have a lot more support in the end to actually put the time in there to make sure that those are the best and most well-constructed tests and are providing that best and most valuable information.
Melissa, you mentioned value a couple times, and valuable. And, management, they like to look at metrics, right? So one of the most easiest things to look at is percentage. And so that's why they want to look at percentage of automation with the denominator being the manual tests. But what other things can we say, hey, this is not the right metric. The real metric you should look at is, and what is that?
Yeah, so that's kind of ideally where the A of A, the automated of automatable, comes in, right? And so what we say is that the team has determined that here is our automation criteria, and we say that the most important suite of tests that we're going to automate first is the smoke test. And so of the stories that we are committing to for the sprint, or if you're in a Kanban model of the stories that we are our highest priority right now, we've determined X number of these stories have smoke test functionality in there. And based off of that, the number of stories that are can be translated into smoke tests equals this. And then we wind up hitting that very high 90+% of the automated of automatable. And that automatable really is that kind of dividing factor. And so the A of A still is a percentage, but it's a percentage of what did we determine should be automated, and then what actually was automated based off of that determination. And that becomes both standard within all teams, but then specific and unique to the project team and where that automation is going and supporting.
Okay, that makes good sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, so when I talk about, this is, I show kind of what it looks like. This is a very typical org structure in teams that I've managed in the past. And so you can kind of look here that there's no automation engineer that looks in here. We've kind of moved in, and I've got lots of talks around the quality engineer and what I mean by what I say quality engineer. But really what this says is that based off of the quality engineer components, there are expectations of test automation and sometimes performance testing and sometimes security and accessibility testing that is assigned for each role. So as an associate quality engineer coming in, you may have some some limited or maybe some expertise around certain tools and components, but you still have the expectation of testing and doing all the things that a quality engineer is responsible for, but you have some skill sets around more technical testing activities such as test automation. And as you kind of move up through the chain, as you move into the software quality engineer and then the senior software quality engineer, there is a component of test automation and technical testing techniques and services that each of these roles within an organization that I've either built or run is in there. And so as you kind of look up and kind of move up the ladder, and then at some point somebody makes a decision of, do I want to perhaps explore options within the management track, and if so, I may start looking at becoming a lead or kind of taking on some of those more HR management responsibilities. If I want to stay within more of a technical track, I might start going into an architect or a principal in our organization. But the main point by showing this is that there is no automation engineer or performance engineer. We hire people based off of their skill sets that they bring in, and they may have extensive test automation experience, but the expectation is that they are still responsible for interacting with the software from a user advocacy standpoint. And so, it might be helpful for me to kind of, define what I mean by a quality engineer. But really what I mean is that, it's somebody who has the technical acumen to be able to use tools and technology to make their job more efficient, but that they're always advocating for the user. And so those kind of mixed, it combined is what how I define the quality engineer as it relates to organizations that I've either consulted with or I run.
That's interesting, because we work with a lot of organizations on automation, and one of the first things we say when we embark on an automation effort is that we can't automate what we don't understand. Right. And so you have to really understand the software before you can do any automation. Otherwise, you're just a button clicker.
Exactly. Yep, that's absolutely right. And actually, that's right. And this is exactly what this next slide is here, right? And so, if at any point, what I and certainly what I spoke about at PNSQC this week was, I put a lot of emphasis on the refinement or grooming sessions, and I advocate for smaller working sessions where anyone that has responsibility within that story to complete any tasks in there are part of those refinement sessions. So if we've identified a story that has, that where our individual automation criteria says, hey, this is a candidate for automation because it meets our smoke test criteria, then we have the person in that refinement session, because there are going to be things that person who has the test automation experience is going to advise dev on. And if you kind of look at what refinement is and where it should be within your overall planning, workflow, this is one of the key sessions, whether, again, if it's a more formal meeting, which I advise against simply because you just can't get a lot of work done there. But if you kind of turn that over and say, hey, we're going to have refinements that are more working sessions and much more collaborative with everybody that has responsibility on the story, then you can really start having those conversations. And before coding starts on those stories, we get that check and sort of that gate of refining that story first. But the idea is that you bring in that person who's going to be automating, and they're going to be consultative and advising dev on how they should be building their code in order to support automation. Because there's that whole component of, just because it can be tested doesn't necessarily mean that it can be automated. And so if you can get that as quickly to the left as possible and influence, how coding is being done before coding starts, that's going to be the most efficient and most productive way to tackle that. And so when you have a well-defined refinement, where the outcome is that everyone that has responsibility on this to complete tasks associated with the story are present, they're collaborative, then you have a much tighter feedback loop when work actually starts with that. So again, we're kind of, so having those clear strategy and definitions, of course, we always want to align with the industry, right? And so there's no need for us to reinvent the wheel every time that we create an automation strategy. We should certainly be reaching out to the community, and there are dozens and dozens of people that I would say have nailed this, and they know what a good automation strategy is, and they're almost always willing to share their experience. So instead of reinventing or inventing for yourself or creating something, it's much easier to reach out to the community, see what's worked for them, and then see what applies within your own organization. But the idea is that that strategy is consistent across anyone that is executing within that strategy. So anyone that has test automation responsibilities should be operating under the same general guidelines, and then they're able to put their creative license in there as they start working uniquely with their individual project teams. As we all know, there's no cookie cutter solution for team A is always like team B is always like team C. There's always going to be things that need to be consistent, of course, because that's how you become scalable. But there are things that are going to be always unique and custom to the project teams. And that's really where that person who has that quality engineer that has test automation expertise, that's really where they get to shine, because they are simply not told to automate X number of tests, and they become the machine, as you mentioned earlier, Phil, but they become really a much more collaborative and contributor to the project team and its success. So when we talk about the myths of, kind of the QA, or QE, or the automation engineer owns all the automation, this is kind of where the meat, what I was talking about, of how we like to approach this. So number one, if we don't know what our counterparts, generally to the left of us, our development counterparts are doing on their own with test automation, then, or any type of automation, then that's the first step. A lot of times when I ask this question, again, kind of in live sessions, is, how many of you know what, where you can find the results of your unit tests, and what the individual coverage or expectations are within the dev team. And almost always very few hands go up, which means that we are not being we're not sharing that information. And what that generally causes is QA or QE then feels the need, because they don't have any insight or transparency into what dev has been doing from a unit test standpoint, or an integration test automation standpoint, is that they feel then that they own all the test automation. And so what we want to avoid in this situation is redundancy. I've seen some beautiful unit and integration tests that are being done by dev that's very gated, and that they run green before they can ever merge, or in worst case scenarios before they can deploy out to the next environment. But the idea is that if we don't have insight into that, or if it's not consistent and we're left guessing what dev is doing, then we feel the need that we then own all the automation. And so when we deep dive into that, there is a lot of redundancy in there. So what we like to say is, the first priority of tests that happen are these intake tests. And as you can see here, I tend to align with the ISTQB for definitions. One of the best things that has come out of that organization is the glossary, and this is just a little bit of a push there. But if you have if terminology is not consistent across your own individual QA teams, or certainly within your own development organizations, I would certainly align with the ISTQB, because it's a handy glossary and it really goes through in here. So when I talk about an intake test, you can read the definition here, but it really is this is something that dev generally owns. And it's kind of the combination of unit and integration tests in there. And so when we first talk about, well, who owns test automation, the ones that really start this are the developers. And we really want to make sure that we understand what dev is doing and what their expectations are within their team, so that we can then use a better coverage and a more comprehensive test automation strategy when we start automating functions to the right of them. But the key is that we need to understand what dev is doing, what their cycle is, and what expectations are, so then we can build a much more complementary and non-redundant automation suite, again, with a higher comprehensive strategy and greater coverage.
Yeah, just a note about the ISTQB. I know a lot of folks shy away from it or disapprove of it and so on, but I think it's a great start. It enables you to do calculus if you already know algebra, and the ISTQB is the algebra of testing.
Exactly. I've been using the ISTQB glossary for over 10 years, and I've taken it with it to every company that I've ever been in for the last 10 years. And really, I mean, the quick win is that don't define terms on your own that have already been defined by the industry. And the best way to find that is to look at the ISTQB glossary and see whether or not there's a for it, and then implement that within your own team.
Right. No reason to reinvent the wheel, right?
That's exactly right. So then as we kind of go down this, as we put a little bit more detail and meat into the next priority, right? And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but, in our world, I like to advise on automating those smoke tests because, again, the ISTQB definition, which is what you can obviously read here, that, these are the critical and crucial functions of a program. I personally like to align smoke tests with the CRUD approach: create, read, update, delete, simply because that's, you can even with this great ISTQB definition, any individual or team can then, define that a little bit more detailed on their own. But if we're looking for a start on, what really does crucial functions or critical functions mean, and if that question isn't clear within your own organization, I like to advise on simply CRUD. So when you start building this, your smoke tests really become the building blocks of a lot of the other tests that come out of here. So when you start expanding your smoke test outside of that CRUD approach, then you start your journey into wider regression, and those regressions may be more end-to-end, or they might be slightly localized or global. But essentially, when you start out with saying, hey, we've defined our critical and crucial functions using the CRUD approach, then that is a great that then kind of leads, when you're in that refinement working session, you look at that and say, hey, this user story has smoke test criteria in there. I'm flagging this, and this will be automated, and I can start that automation now. And so you kind of build off of that basic building block of that smoke test in there. And really, if you even need further clarity, if this function were to be broken on production, or if a user were to report it, would this cause a hot fix on your part, or a catastrophic kind of failure in your organization? If the answer is yes, those are great candidates for test automation. And so that's where we kind of go back down to that building. So instead of saying that QA or QE owns all the automation, and instead of saying that we should automate everything or hit a certain percentage of test cases to be automated, now we're really focusing and fine-tuning those definitions so that we kind of start in that way of what percentage of our intake tests are automated, and then we do that diff, and then we start automating the most important critical functionality within the QA team that owns a lot of that in there. So these are kind of good clarity points. If you're struggling to understand in your organization what a smoke test is, here are some ways for you to kind of determine that on your own by using the industry, but also by using some approaches that we've found success in. And then if, assuming that those P1 and P2 tests are running green, then, and really only then, not only then, I don't want it to necessarily be prescriptive or mandated, but if you've got smoke tests that are running red and you are focusing on automating other areas outside of those, then we need to shift our our priorities, which is why, again, I kind of go back to that P1 through P3 scale. If any of those are failing to the left, then your trigger should be to fix those and get those running green before you start on any lower priority items. So for example, the QE, and in some cases, the product owner or product or the business, we tend to tie these to user advocacy. And these may look like key customers or end-to-end flows. By kind of collaboratively working with product, this gets a little bit more buy-in. If you're not sure whether or not your agile team is going to be initially receptive to kind of building in automation as part of success within the sprint, then sometimes you can buddy up with your product and say, hey, look, this is going to be tied to key customer flows. And of course, product should be thinking about the user and the customer when they're writing their stories. So these are kind of areas and success criteria that we've used in the past. Sometimes we've tied our P3 test automation to acceptance criteria. So if you've got a user story with 3 or 4 acceptance criteria in there, sometimes we will tie our P3 automation to the acceptance criteria. So again, the idea here is that it's collaborative and it's not necessarily one person or one automation engineering team within a company that's telling the team what to automate. It's much more collaborative, and ideally then it's going to be much more embraced by your other project team members. And then if you've successfully gotten P1, 2, and 3 tests running green, then I like to kind of move into what we call the dealer's choice, which is then what makes sense for the project. And again, this is where really the true creative and consultative nature of a good quality engineer with heavy test automation experience, this is where we can really shine and show a lot of our project value, or a lot of our value, but also our kind of creative license here. And we're consultative on areas that we believe should be automated after that. But again, kind of going in that cyclical way of P1, P2, P3, and in that order in a lot of ways, it's somewhat prescriptive, but it also ensures that we are aligned with several checkpoints, that we're just not randomly automating things because we're trying to hit a number, but we're really fine-tuning and focusing on the automation that's going to make the most sense and provide the most valuable within those specific cycles of development that are going on within the project team.
You just used a really important term there. You said a quality engineer with automation experience rather than an automation engineer.
That's right. Exactly right. Right. And which is why, I've removed the automation engineer title or role out of teams for, probably going on 10 years now, because we've really focused that quality engineer with test automation experience. And it really kind of applies to performance engineers, right? You can kind of have the same structure of talk with performance engineering, and it's a quality engineer with performance testing experience. And that's exactly how I like to structure it, because I think it's much more clear.
Right.
Again, we kind of talked a little bit about the selection process, but this is adding a little bit more. So when we look at the misperception of the middleman strategy, right? And so kind of just a slight reminder, the middleman strategy, that you somehow have a tester that is the person that tells the automator what to automate, but that the automator doesn't get involved until that tester has somehow tested it and then has determined that code is stable, right? So really what you've done in that point is you've kind of added an inefficient workflow or process or step within your workflow that is not as efficient as it needs to be. So of course, I'm always going to say that, again, if you go back to my definition of how I define successful refinement, it is that everyone is present or collaboratively working through that story because they've been noted as having responsibilities on there. So by embedding the automator, or in my world, a quality engineer with test automation experience within the team, they're going to be able to start that work much sooner, and we eliminate that need for a middleman or that tester that then kind of checks the box and says, this should be automated, this should be automated, this should be automated, right? And so then we have much more, then we actually start our test automation, and in a lot of ways, when we're highly functioning and highly mature, we will have that automation happening within the same sprint. And certainly in a lot of cases, before that story actually becomes shippable, it's actually automated, it's running in the pipeline. And so you can see that we're now kind of gaining a lot of efficiencies. And if you're in a situation where you may have automation happening a sprint behind, or in some cases several sprints behind the testing, then you've kind of eliminated that, and you're getting that instant feedback from sprint to sprint to sprint. And I kind of have used, I like to say, I've stolen this concept or this term of definition of done. This, we kind of use this, I've got a lot of talks on definition of done here, but when we say done, we really tie that to kind of shippable. Like, is this component, is this story shippable? And if it is, then we tie the most important concepts like test automation and unit tests, and is it fully tested and all that, and we tie that to our definition of done, and our definition of done therefore becomes shippable. So again, I hopefully I shouldn't have to speak too much on this slide around the hits, but it's a replacement of humans. But we talked a lot about these concepts. So if we have a good test automation strategy in place, then we free the testers up to do much more important things like test. They're interacting with the software. We can emphasize non-scripted testing, and when I say non-scripted testing, exploratory ad hoc, not that they are kind of a free-for-all, but the concept and the approach for a non-scripted testing is slightly different than scripted testing. But we know that the greatest number of bugs are going to be uncovered during exploratory sessions. So the more that we can free up the testers to be able to focus in actually interacting with the software is where we want our testers to be. And of course, when we start looking at professional and career development, if you have been adverse, or if you haven't, if you've shied away from, learning test automation because you're not sure, you don't have, a lot of good mentoring around there. There are plenty of people and free courses to take to start getting that experience. But for those of you who are managers or directors who are looking to help your traditional manual testers start picking up test automation, there are ways to do it. And we've successfully been able to implement training within our QA teams to get people who have had zero test automation experience up and running within about 4 to 6 weeks of doing kind of basic automation. And you're getting their feet wet, you're getting them experience and exposure to test automation, and eventually they should be taking that and developing their own career, given those building blocks of kind of the basics, running the tests, editing those tests, and troubleshooting them. So with that said, we kind of gone through the misses, right? The numbers game. How do we address those? Well, the A of A and some of those other, areas that we go through. The pedestal effect, right? The automation engineer is somehow better, or a better role, or more important than the tester on the team. We embed them and we envelop them within the Agile team, and specifically getting them involved in the refinement. The miss of QA owning automation, it's our job to understand all testing that's being done, whether we're responsible for it or not, and to ensure that we always have a fine-tuned and efficient strategy in place. So we like to go through that P1 through 3, but it's important to know what dev is doing to make sure that we're not redundant with things that they may have already incorporated within their own strategy. If we have that middleman strategy, we want to make sure that it's an efficient solution. And, you know, and if it is, and we use that if then, we have a much more efficient selection process, and we can quickly automate those so that that automation is actually happening within the sprint that the rest of the work is going in. And, you know, the replacement, right? Again, I hope that I won't have to be calling this out much more in my career. But if that is actually, as Phil mentioned earlier, you know, if there is some sort of stigma or some sort of goal or outcome that by having a QA strategy or an automation strategy in place is somehow going to reduce the number of folks, explore that a little bit more and understand how and why. But really, we want to see that it is an enhancement to the testers, and that they'll be able to free up their time to focus on much more valuable activities by coupling with a good automation strategy. So here are, as Phil mentioned, they'll be recording on this, but if you do have any questions outside of this that you've thought about after we have some time for Q&A right after, then please feel free to contact me. I hear from a lot of people a lot of times, so I'd love to kind of hear what you've been doing in your own automation strategy. So with that said, I'll kind of open it up for any questions if they haven't already been asked and answered.
Yeah, we do have one question that came in, is that, the skills of automation people or automation engineers and testers, sometimes they're different. And so, maybe people that are real coders are not interested in, being testers in a way, and vice versa. So that creates the middleman effect. And, how do we really get rid of the middleman effect?
Yeah, and not to necessarily say that the quality engineer is the silver bullet for that, but I have found so much more success into creating the quality engineer and having, just as you would put in, required skills in a job description, you would put that in the quality engineer. But the idea is that if you've ever set up a role, especially within QA and QE teams and organizations, where that responsibility is that person is not responsible for interacting with the software on behalf of the users, then you're not capitalizing on them. I think we should be just as we should want to delight our users, and we should want to be able to advocate for the best user experience that we can. And from a team standpoint, not just from a QA or QE standpoint, but we should have that at the forefront of what is driving our software development lifecycle at any time. So in that case, I would say that yes, there's absolutely people who have automation experience, absolutely have coding experience, and you can be a really good coder and employ test automation tools or a tool or a framework as a QE, because it's going to allow you to interact with that software on behalf of the user. And that's kind of really what we strive to do within that. So that's why I kind of put that emphasis on the quality engineer with test automation experience, or quality engineer with performance testing experience. And you can kind of fill in the blanks when we talk about security and accessibility and other things that are relevant to the company.
Okay. Well, I think we're about to wrap up here. We don't have any more questions right now. Here's one more, and I'm not sure if there's really enough time to answer this, but we can try a little bit. They're asking about the types of tools that are the easiest to learn, because, if you have a person that's a tester, like you were talking about, with no real programming background, where should they get started?
Yeah, and I would say try not to focus on a tool, because as we all know, tools come and go. Tools get mature, and sometimes they get sunsetted, right? So for me, the best way is to focus on an object-oriented programming, just kind of a basic, course or basic fundamentals of object-oriented programming. And in that case, you can start understanding the language that's associated with development. So in that case, instead of focusing on a tool, I would go down that route. But if, of course, we all know that, from an open source standpoint, Selenium, is probably one of the most widely adopted frameworks that are in place. So if you're looking for that, I would say that that's certainly not a bad place to start, but it's much, in my opinion anyway, I think it's much more important to focus on coding fundamentals than a tool, because without understanding the coding fundamentals, the tools are going to be meaningless.
Right. I mean, I would like to encourage folks because, as testers, we're already very, very logical and flow oriented. And that's really all you need as a foundation for programming skills. And I like to think of it in terms of, when you go to travel to Italy, for instance, if you learn 100 words, you can kind of get around a little bit and make your way around Italy. And I think the same thing goes with any tool. Or, if you learn 100 programming constructs or 100 different types of statements, which is not hard to do, you can pretty much get around and really add some value.
Absolutely.
Independent of whatever tool it is. So it doesn't take that long, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Melissa. And I really appreciate your time and contributing to our community and our listeners and audience. And I guess we'll be seeing you again soon. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Take care, everybody.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.